You know, it's interesting how we celebrate this whole thing about Good Friday and Easter and the fact of the resurrection. One of the most pivotal things that actually transpired during the time of this this aspect of Good Friday is during the time when Jesus was crucified. One of the as you look at the intricate pieces, about April, I want to say April the 4th or April the 5th, he met with his disciples, and they had a nice evening meal, getting ready, preparing for Passover. And during that time, they're around the table, and he's about to, you know, he washes their feet, and they sit down, they have a meal, and they're dipping pieces of bread. And at the time, he sensed that somebody was going to betray him. And we all know, as we read the scripture, it was Judas. As time went on, and this is about AD, April 7th, AD 30. As time went on, they get up from the meal, and they make their way down to the garden. We call it the Garden of Gethsemane. And it's recorded in the book of Matthew how they all go down to the garden. But before they even went down to the garden, Jesus talks about how, you know, he reminded them how he was going to suffer and he was going to die. And Peter was the most outspoken one and said, no, it's not going to happen. In fact, Jesus actually had to rebuke him, right? But it's interesting as this starts to unfold. Jesus tells Judas, do what you do and do it quickly. At the moment, Judas slips out quietly, and he goes to notify Caiaphas of what's going to transpire, because Judas didn't know if Jesus was coming back into Jerusalem or not. So as they go into the garden, they leave that meal, they go into the garden. Jesus goes into the garden. He happens to go into the garden to pray. And during that time of prayer, he takes Peter, James, and John, and he goes into the innermost part of the garden, and he actually has the three wait at a certain point, and he goes to pray. And Jesus, knowing that what was going to transpire, it became real serious during his prayer. It became real serious, to the point to where he went back to check on them as he's praying, went back to check on 3 of the disciples, and they were asleep. And he's like, can't you stay up and pray with me? Obviously, they didn't know the magnitude, and they didn't know the seriousness of what was going to transpire. What we understand is, as Jesus goes back and he talks to them, he's like, hey, can't you stay up? Can't you? And they can't keep their eyes open. So Jesus goes back and goes to pray. And at the time when he starts to pray, it got real more intense, to the point to where, as Jesus was praying, he was asking the Father, if it be thy will, take this cup from me. I don't want this. Knowing good and well the place and the path that he's going down, he didn't want to do it. It's no different from any one of us. And as he's going down that path, it got even so intense, where the Bible says as he prayed, it got so intense, he started sweating, and in that sweat, it became as drops of blood. And that is a medical condition that's called hemotridosis. And it's actually a confirmed, if a person is actually so stressed that their pores open up, and the blood in their vein and their blood vessels start to explode, and it actually seeps into the pores when a person sweats. And as that time after Jesus prays, the Bible says he gets up, he goes back to his disciples. Now, as he's coming down, now think about it, as he's coming down to go meet them, and in the distance he can actually see a lantern or a fire, a torch coming up as he's coming down. And he wakes up, as he's coming down closer to his disciples, there's a group, he sees another group coming up. Now, notice Judas at this time had already notified Caiaphas. He already talked to, got the temple guards to come with him. And it was dark, so they wouldn't know who Jesus was, because it was after they left. It was on early morning, about like April the 7th, early morning AD, April 7th AD, and they didn't know who Jesus was. I would say it was about 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. So you notice the tenseness of this time. Jesus is up at 2 o'clock in the morning praying, and you can see the natural part where it's early, they're asleep, but the most intense moment, knowing that he is going to a place, he's going down a road that nobody else can understand nor comprehend. So as he's coming down, he wakes his disciples up, and then as he wakes them up and they're coming down as a group, the guards from the temple are coming up with Judas. Now, they didn't notice who Jesus was, and Judas had already notified him, I'll let you know who he is by a kiss. So as they meet each other, the temple guards are there, and Judas comes up, Master, and they call it the kiss of death. And he kisses him on the cheek, and the temple guards say, we have a arrest warrant. We have somewhat of an arrest warrant for Jesus. And now they shackle him. At the time that they grab him, Peter pulls a sword out, slashes one of the guard's ears off. And Jesus quickly grabs the ear, puts it back on, heals him immediately. But yet that still didn't stop their mission, and their purpose was there to arrest and to get Jesus. So as they take him away, they take Jesus away. Now, again, this is like 2:30 in the morning. They go to Caiaphas. They actually go to the high priest. Now, Caiaphas he's the son-in-law of Ananias. Ananias is actually the chief priest. He's actually the chief priest. Now, he's a part of the Sanhedrin. And Caiaphas is in line to be one of the high priests. So the guards, they grab Jesus and they make their way down to the high priest's house, Ananias. And as they make their way down to the high priest's house, they bring Jesus into the middle court. Now, what's interesting about it is that the procedure when a person is found guilty religiously, you have to summon the 70 elders. You have to summon all of the Sanhedrin. They only had a small group of the Sanhedrin. Now, if I were to back up, I want to give some perspective. Now, Ananias he was very upset, and Caiaphas, they were very upset at Jesus because a few days prior, when Jesus was in Jerusalem, he overturned the money changers. Now, what's said is that when they exchange money in the temple, that money, they exchange it at a higher rate. So when they exchange the denarii for the temple shekel, they exchange it for a higher rate, which is directly connected to the high priest. So the high priest gets a cut off of it. And not only the high priest, the governor of Rome gets a cut of it. And then not only the governor gets a cut of it, but Tiberius, the emperor, gets a cut of it. So everybody is getting a piece of this money exchange. So they were cheating the people in order for their own economic gain, their own economic prosperity, which is, in actuality, is greed. So Jesus disrupted that flow of money. Now think about it. It's during Passover. There are oodles of people. Now think about how much money these guys are going to make. All these people there, they're going to make bucket loads of money. So as the time, you only have a small group of the Sanhedrin, and you had, not only did you had Nicodemus there, and you had the Joseph, one of the other ones that later on takes Jesus' body. But notice that at the time, they're now taking Jesus to court with only a handful, a small group of people that were in this. They were in his house, and they were seeing Jesus, and they were trying him for blasphemy. They had an ulterior motive because Jesus was messing up their program. As they get to try him, the whole time while they're talking, Jesus doesn't say a word. Doesn't say a word. And they ask him, "Are you the King of the Jews?" And eventually he says, "I am." He can't lie to himself of his position. And what happens is, they take him out back, some of the temple guards, and they say, "Well, since you are a prophet," they rough him up a little bit before they take him over to Pilate, because they really, at the time, they really can't. They have nothing. They didn't have lawful order, nor were they have legal right to actually kill Jesus, because at the time they were in submission to Rome. Rome was in control at the time, so they took all their legal rights to take away from them, so they could not legally kill anybody based on a religious standpoint. So the guards take Jesus to a back room. They slow walk Jesus to Pilate's. And during that time, they cover Jesus' face and they're hitting him. And they say, "Who hit you? Tell us now, prophet. Who hit you now?" Each one of them taking a shot at Jesus. "Who hit you now, prophet?" While they're giving him blow after blow to his face. "Who hit you now, prophet?" They bring him back into the court. Face is bloody. Jaw swollen. I mean, he's visually battered. Now they have to take him to Pilate. And one thing about when they take him to Pilate, this was about, all this transpired between, now you're looking at 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, 8 o'clock. Pilate's up now. They go to Pilate, knock on his gate. Now, one thing about during the time of Passover, it's unclean for a Jew to actually go into a Roman province. So they knock on the gate, and Pilate comes down to the gate to meet him. And then he's like, "What do you want? We have this man to be tried." He was like, "Listen, I have no necessity for him. It's no big deal. I'm not governed by your religious law." He says he's a king. Oh, so he says he's a king of the Jews. Well, have him go see Herod. Since Herod is the governor or the tetrarch over the Jews, he's actually the so-called puppet king of the Jews. Go out and see Herod. They take him to Herod. Once they take him to Herod, Herod is excited because he's been hearing about Jesus. Now notice, this is the same Herod that had John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, killed. They take him to go see Herod. Now Herod, he has a different mindset. He wants to see a miracle. He wants to see a parlor trick. He wants to see Jesus to do a parlor trick. This whole time, Jesus, even though he's beaten and battered, he still has his composure. Doesn't say a word. He's not feeding into the madness. Calm. He's still under control, but yet understands the seriousness of what's transpiring. He has his wits about him. At the time while they're at Herod's house, there's a rush, because they have to get this thing taken care of before they start doing actually the Passover, and before they start killing the lambs. So they're kind of on a rush. Caiaphas is actually kind of on a rush as they go over to Herod's house. Of course, Jesus wasn't gonna amuse Herod by doing a miracle as a cheap parlor trick. So Herod, what he does, he roughs Jesus up more. They beat him more. So now Herod's like, "Look, I have no need for him. He didn't do nothing to me. I'm done. Send him back to Pilate. Send him to Pilate." So they walk Jesus back down back down the street. In fact, let me take this back. They did ask him that pivotal question, are you the Son of God? Are you the King? He says, I am. I am. He doesn't deny it. Caiaphas got so angry, which is out of character for a next in line high priest. He got so angry, he walked up to Jesus and screamed and ripped Jesus' tunic open from top. He ripped it from top to bottom, which is so totally out of character of a next in line high priest. So eventually they walk him, they take him from Herod, they walk him over to Pilate's house. And then finally Pilate says, okay, fine, bring him in, I'll see him. Well, as they bring Jesus in, the one thing about, as they go into this courtyard area where it's a common courtyard, it's not actually Pilate's house. So now the Jews, the Sanhedrin, can go into that area and actually witness, they can actually witness the whole interaction with Pilate and Jesus. So now Pilate is actually putting him on trial. They say that you're a king. Are you a king? He says, I am, but my kingdom is not of this world. He says, because if I would call my servants, if my servants would come down and wipe this place out, I'm paraphrasing. He says, but this is not that time. He says, oh, you are a king, huh? Which in Pilate's mind, now think about this, in Pilate's mind, now that Jesus professes to be a king, it directly goes against Rome. So now because it goes against Rome, it goes against Caesar. And anytime a person professes to be somebody that goes against the government or the country that's in charge at the time, he now becomes a threat. So Pilate, he's still not convinced. He's like, look, this man, he hasn't done anything. You're charging him of blasphemy. In my eyes, he still hasn't done anything. So here's what I'll do. I'll do you guys a favor. I'll flog him a couple of times, and then we're gonna let him go. So what they do, now think about this, during this time, they have, Jerusalem is being packed full of people. They actually had extra garrison of guards in Jerusalem at the time. They also have a special group called the Death Squad. And the Death Squad, these are professional executioners. These individuals were stationed there, and what they did was practice execution. They were they got a thrill out of it. The execution, in fact, it was something that they thrived on, because what they believed was the more gruesome the execution or the more pain that they imposed, it was to show the might of Rome, to show them Rome does not play. And anybody who tries to come against Rome, we take it personal, and we want you to know that Rome is in control. So now they tie Jesus up to a pole. And they had this thing, they call it the cat o' nine tails. But the thing about the cat o' nine tails, it's called the scorpentine whip. And one thing about that, at the tips, they would tie bone, which is curved. Now, one key thing about when they tied Jesus up, he was already battered and bruised and beat up pretty good. They tie him to a pole that's fixed, that he can't even move. Anytime he tries to flex or try to move or fidget, it actually, what it does is it flexes the muscle. And every time that it flexes the muscle, they whip him. The bone or the scorpentine, the flechette or the little knives go into his flesh. And one thing I did some research about that process of whipping. It wasn't the fact that they whipped him hard. In fact, it wasn't even as hard that their forward swing. It was in the back pulling that was more agonizing. It wasn't the fact that the forward momentum. it was actually when they pulled it back, which caused the most damage. In fact, it was said that the harder that they pull back, you can even expose flesh and internal organs of how many times, based on how many times they whipped the person. So these guys, they got excited off of taking part in this execution. So they end up beating him, and they whipped him, and they whipped him, and they whipped him. It was said that they would whip people so hard that the person would literally go into shock, or he would actually vomit because the excruciating pain that the person actually endured. They get done with whipping Jesus. To add insult to injury, the guards take him back to the back, and now they take him back to the back. Now, one thing I forgot to say is that Herod actually draped Jesus he draped Jesus with a purple robe, and that purple robe represented royalty. So now think about this, he's getting beaten. After he's beaten, the guards take him back to the back and they put the purple robe on him. And not only do they say, all hail, but they are spitting in his face. The Roman guards, now the centurions are getting involved. And then they fashion this piece of stick, and they put a stick in his hand. And then they get a crown of thorns, and they weave these thorns. Now, the one thing about this, I forgot the certain type of tree. The long thorns, they force it on his head, which now it jabs into his skull, and it reaches, the thorns actually touch or reach to the bone. Then they parade Jesus around and all hail the king. So after they beat Jesus, they ridicule him. And then you have some guards that are getting on their knees and they're saying, all hail. Jesus is bloody. Blood is protruding from his forehead, protruding from his back, from his body. In fact, it was said that he was unrecognizable. That's how bad they beat him. They bring him back to the back. Now Pilate, he knew that there was a clause in the Hebrew law that during that time, as a tribute to Tiberius and as the good gesture of Rome, we can actually release somebody. Now, at the same time, they had a man called Barabbas in jail. And Barabbas was in jail for treason. In fact, it was said that he was there for theft. And the reason why they call it theft, because he caused an uprising, and he was stealing power away from Rome. Now, Pilate said, as a good gesture, since I really don't have anything on Jesus, I'm going to pose the fact that I'll get Jesus off my radar. I can get him out of here. So he goes back to the courtyard and he says, listen, I can release one person. I got Barabbas, who's locked up, and then I got Jesus. I just got done beating Jesus. You guys should be satisfied. Who do you want? The Jews that were still in the courtyard, now I want to give some context. The Jews that were still in the courtyard were the people that profited off of the money changers. These were the same people that had a money flow. What do you think that they're going to say? They said, give us Barabbas. Give us Barabbas. Think about it. Barabbas' name is Bar Abbas, which means son of fathers, son of our father. Son of our father. They were saying, give us Barabbas, Bar Abbas, son of our fathers, which is, Bar is son, and Abbas is fathers. So they say, we want Barabbas. So Pilate brings a golden bowl full of water. He dips his hand in the water and washes his hand as a symbolic gesture that this man's blood is not on my hands. It's all on you. At that time, now they prepare this big wooden, about a 75, a plank that's nice and large that goes across the shoulders of Jesus, and they make him carry his own death sentence. They said, some say that it was about 75 pounds, some say it was about 150 pounds. But think about this, Jesus, being a carpenter, he knows how to manipulate, he knows how to carry wood. But being so weak and battered, now Jesus carries his own death sentence to the place called the Hill of the Skull, Golgotha. Now granted, Jesus couldn't make it. He's bloodied, he's battered. His blood is actually coagulating. Tries to walk up that hill and he falls. They actually get Joseph of Arimathea, which is an African Jew, to help him pick up the wooden plank. As they take him up the hill, they had to go quickly. They tied Jesus, they put him on the ground, they lay the plank across his shoulders, and then they nailed right in the carpal tunnel, right in between the carpal bone. Doesn't break a bone. Both hands. Amazingly doesn't break a bone. Then they fashioned his feet. Now, one practice about the Romans is that they usually, if they want people to suffer long, they would put a little seat on the on the wooden planks to where he could sit down and go through more torture. But because this is an important moment and Jesus had to be killed before their festival, they leave the seat out. Then they lift him up. And now, one thing about the crucifix is that it's meant to cause torture and pain, because as he's lifted up, you have to lift up your shoulders in order to bleed, or in order to breathe. But while he's breathing, fluid is filling up into his lungs. So while he's struggling to try to lift up, fluid is constantly filling up into his lungs. Then they nail his feet, and then they let him sit there. Then at the time, as they're gathering around, there's still some people, some Roman guards at his feet. You know, they're actually playing craps on the bottom for his robe, betting on his robe. And Jesus sits there on the cross while he hangs his head down, and his lungs filling up full of fluid. After he has interaction with two people that were on, I believe these were the same two people that were with Barabbas that caused the problem. One had enough strength to mock Jesus. The other one asked Jesus for forgiveness. Even during that time, Jesus forgave a person while he was on the same cross. As time's passing, just a little bit of time in between there, Jesus says, now notice, during this whole time, Jesus didn't even have a drink of water. From the time that they arrested him, from the time that they beat him, from the time he gets to Golgotha, didn't even have a sip of water. One of his last things he says is, I thirst. The thing that they give him is sour wine mixed with vinegar. That's his last drink that he gets. And the Bible says that, it says, Father, why have thou forsaken me? Then after that, the Bible lets us know that he hangs his head. And just as the sun goes down, Jesus, the sun goes down. And he dies. After he hangs his head and dies, now the rush is on because they got to they have to bury Jesus. During that time, Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, now notice they were part of the Sanhedrin, the two silent believers. They get Pilate's to agree to give him the body of Jesus, and they take him down, and now they carry his body to the tomb where Joseph purchased. They didn't even have enough time to actually wash his body of oil, but they rubbed it down. They had all different kind of incense, myrrh and aloe, and they wrapped his body. They didn't wrap it too tight because they didn't know if Jesus was completely dead. But it does tell us that during that time, they pierced his side and blood and water came out to let us know that he did die. As they wrapped his body, I can visually see them saying their last goodbyes. As they're getting ready to walk out, I can see him pause and say, "Man, the teacher, the master's dead." Then they walk out and then they roll the stone in front of the tomb. I wonder as they were walking away, or any time the disciples, while they were still trying to gather their bearing, I wonder if anybody remembered the words that Jesus said. If you destroy this temple, in 3 days, I'll be able to raise it back up again.